Previously on the Seventh Valkyrie, the horns cry out for war, and Meridia's growing legend inspires the men of the new city into a conquering frenzy. But the old city has stood for centuries, and their forces assemble to respond, next on the Seventh Valkyrie. At best, former residents. The heat of battle was her territory. The Edoran command craft set out into the clear waters lit by the battle lamps from the city and the orbiting patrol boats. In time, they were joined by the dozen boats of their honor guard, and began to lead the way in formation towards the glowing lights of the barge in the distance. Around them, all across the cove, the rest of the new city navy moved into position, awaiting their orders for Operation Cleansing Fire. If, by the midnight deadline, the old city leaders had surrendered, a flare with white smoke would be fired into the sky, and the Edoran war force would move onto the barge to secure the old city's leaders. Then, bearing their heads as the symbol of the old city's surrender, the rest of the Edoran forces would advance to shore and establish a beachhead. From there, the Edorans would have a foothold in the old city, which they would defend until the bridge could be completed and Reen fully retaken. If the deadline was missed, the flare that went up would trail red smoke, and the plan was almost exactly the same. The Edoran forces would secure the barge, execute the heads of the four families, and begin to take the old city. Really, the only distinction with red smoke would be the slaughter of everyone in their way, rather than just most people. Both flares rested on Yosin's belt, and it was to his sole discretion which plan went into effect, which is why Meridia had prepared for hours and hours of battle. As the command craft and its honor guard neared the center of the bay, one of the patrol boats split off from the defensive lines, changing course to meet them. As the other vessel drew up alongside the command craft, Yosin called out for a situation report.
Things are clear, but only until you get close to the river on the barge.
The officer was an old-blood Southlander that Meridia recognized, named Gross.
Once we cross that line, things can get real messy real fast. An inevitability of war,
Yosin shouted back.
Clear a path to the barge and stand ready. Are you sure, sir?
Gross asked, looking over his shoulder.
I can assure you your safety up until we're in range of the barge, but from there, well, you never know what X's will do up close. If the thwarps stand in the way, Yosin said, we will move them. This is a night of victory for Edera, and it's up to the animals how much blood will need to be spilled.
Gross looked uneasy, but then Yosin commanded the vessel forward, and there was no further discussion. The patrol boat raced off at full stroke to pass the word to the other Edoran vessels holding the line. And as the Edoran convoy broke through into the dark no-man's land surrounding the barge, there was a commotion on the far shore. 4 massive vessels, each escorted by their own small fleet of wave runners, had begun to make way from the old city, and where every Edoran vessel was dotted with the lights of battle lamps, each Freelander craft was ringed in the pulsing glow of gifts. Yosin stood up in the center of the vessel, calling out to the entire convoy.
Tonight, we make history. Tonight, we have dragged the leaders of the 4 families out of the darkness and into the light of Edera. Tonight, we reclaim our birthright and retake the shores of Reen that have so long been raped and infested by these savages. Tonight, Edera rises to glory again.
The boats erupted with clanging shields and spears, and the commander whipped them further, calling for blood, for glory, for the cleansing power of the Edoran forces. He began to shout orders, shaping the Edarin line behind them as the command craft surged towards the barge, then slammed their oars in full reverse to slow to a stop. But just as the Edarin command craft kissed up against the barge, the old city line of defenses began to glow brightly, and streaks of water and fire and ice spiraled out into the night over the rise of cacophonous war songs in 4 different languages. The Freelander line made no move to close the gap into the no man's land, but without fail every glowing eye was locked on the Edarin officers, and the streaking gifts arced down into the dark water, landing harmlessly for now. The Freelanders would not be intimidated. Meridia was onto the barge first, drawing her bow and stepping aboard as the front rowers started securing the Edarin flagship. Meridia made rapid sweeps across the vessel as the din of the old city horde grew, holding her focus on the search even as the psychedelic frenzy of Freelanders spread, like many-colored fire surging across the water and detonating as it reached the shore. With a burst, streaks of earth and stone began to thump across the sky from the old city shoreline, joining the streaks of fire, ice, and water that silhouetted the 4 family vessels, now steadily making their way towards the center of the bay. Putting the old city forces to the back of her mind, at least for now, Meridia finished her sweep of the barge, arriving at the pair of tables adorned in Edarin colors, and confirming with a signal that the Edarins had arrived first. Behind her, soldiers began filing onto the barge under the orders of the commander, and Meridia returned to join them. The commander and his advisors had taken up the ornate seats at one of the tables, with soldiers heavily armed and armored in staggered formation behind them, thumping spears and shields on the ground in a steady, unified beat. On a word from Yosin, they could shift into one of 8 different patterns in less than a second, the result of years of regimented training. In all of Edera, you would find few war units superior to a High Commander's honor guard. Noting correctly that there was no position for her at the table or in the formation, Meridia elected to return to the command craft's archer nest. She would be a safe distance away from any gifts, and a few dozen yards was a small price to pay for a clear shot at the leaders of the 4 families. Taking out her spyglass, Meridia scanned the Freelander naval lines before settling on the 4 vessels adorned with vibrant, shining crystal colors. Gold for the Golden Serpent, red for the 3 Flames, deep purple for the Ravens of Dusk, and shimmering blue for the Seekers of Dawn. In her time stationed in the capital, Meridia had hunted the 4 families almost as hard as she had hunted the Machine King. The families had deep roots throughout the outer rings of Mandus, and their influence even stretched into the heart of the capital, where they kept their power through brutal violence and fear. So to see not just one of those leaders, but all 4, sailing calmly towards Edarin waters made Meridia's blood hot, and she could feel her fingers tickling the string of her bow. Despite Yosin's confidence, though, anything could happen now. Before the war, there had supposedly been rules of engagement, of parley and discussion, even between Edarins and Freelanders. But sometime along the way, when the survival of their entire species had been on the line, any form of decency in warfare had evaporated. Still, for now, the peace seemed to hold. The lines on either side of the barge had tightened, but for now, the Edarin soldiers and Old City fighters were more dedicated to hurling insults across the water than gifts or arrows. Neither side could understand the other, but the roars of laughter from their brothers were enough to keep both Edarin and Freelander soldiers taunting. Behind the 4 families, coming towards the barge, even more vessels had taken to the water, and the Thwarp crowd on the shores of the Old City continued to swell. By sheer numbers, the Freelander forces were still dwarfed by the larger Edarin army, especially now that they had been reinforced by thousands of Mandarians and wartime volunteers. But Thwarps didn't win with numbers. Across that sea of colorful lights, you never knew which green glow might manifest ripping spears of earth. Which glow of red was little more than a lantern, and which was a high-level scorcher capable of turning a battlecraft into a flaming husk all on their own. Spotting those threats was the job of Meridia and other skilled soldiers and officers like her. No matter how powerful the X, they could still be killed with an arrow through the heart, a dagger to the throat, or the crushing weight of an Edoran shield charge. Well, with some very rare exceptions. The thumping of Freelander drums grew ever louder, and at a word from the commander, the call of Edoran horns rose against them, creating a clash of sound that brought back deep memories of the war. Meridia caught herself taking a brief glance towards the shoreline, looking for any sign of her partner in crime all these weeks, then caught herself doing it and spit off the side of the boat. The Iron Wolf was with them, even if the False Wolf wasn't. And against the four families, who had now broken through the line and entered the no-man's land surrounding the barge, that would have to be enough. Closest to the river, ringed in gold and flying the flags of the Golden Serpent, was the low-slung, aerodynamic body of an adapted sand speeder, skating across the rolling waves like a snake, powered by some unseen force below the decks. At the center of the sand speeder sat a thin Sandran man, elegantly clad in gold and bronze traditional robes, while armored, veiled, mostly dark-skinned warriors stood at the ready, with their weapons and sand-colored eyes shining. In battle, sand serpents carried pouches of sand from their native lands, which they could use as a weapon, a defense, a distraction, and for any other purpose they could dream up. Next to them was the vessel of the Three Flames, a powerful, steel-reinforced battlecraft that surely had been captured, stolen, or purchased from the Edoran black market. Teruvians had little interest in the sea, but they could operate a vessel just fine if they captured one, and their battlecraft coursed across the waves under the strokes of powerful, dark-skinned Teruvian men rowing in time to pumping drums. And this battlecraft was far more than merely a stolen vessel with a different flag. The Teruvians' flame-powered metalwork could produce wonders, even if their craftsmen lacked the tools of Edoran workers, and to the four families, both Edoran tools and Teruvian flame was easily available. Portions of the craft had been melted apart and reshaped into striking figureheads of drakes and magmaws and charging flare cats, and the entire craft glistened with rubies, magma crystals, and the flickering flames of men in lizard-scale armor. At the command post of the battlecraft was a fire-eyed Teruvian woman in a smoldering red gera, Teruvian formal wear, that was so woven with pulsing crystals she might as well have been clad in magma itself under her own scaled armor. Without the light of the glowing Three Flames flagship, you might have missed the shadowy vessel of the Ravens of Dusk. The only of the four families without a clear national affiliation, the Ravens of Dusk's vessel was of no discernible origin, long and slender, and riding the water on two pontoons. Its crew was equally unreadable, a blend of every color of Freelander and a few people that could even have been Edorans, all dressed in mottled maroons and deep purples intercut with black. Even their apparent leader, a short-haired woman wearing the same outfit as all of her men, was of unclear origin and could easily have hailed from anywhere in Edera or the Freelands. As the Ravens of Dusk got closer, Meridia could pick out the glow of a small team of 3 Sestrans powering the craft, one on each pontoon and one in the center guiding them both. Losing a third of your speed or more with a single arrow was a strategic vulnerability, and Meridia filed that detail away in her brain. The same vulnerabilities did not exist on the Sestran battle runner operated by the Seekers of Dawn. Theirs was a sleek, bullet-shaped craft larger than the Edoran flagship that could be converted into a Sestran-powered battering ram by simply locking in their armored roof. Their presence complicated things. There was no record of any Sestran battle runner ever being defeated in naval combat, and there were plenty of stories of their capacity to destroy. It fit that the Seekers of Dawn, the only Sestran lineage that had taken power on the Edoran continent, would have one. And what it lacked in the flair and decoration of the other flagships, it made up for with a crew working in perfect harmony, all clad in black, silver, and blue sea suits over their light-scale armor. Even the 3 commanders at their head were dressed for the seas, not for surrender. Only a few accents of bone and shell jewelry set apart the leaders of the vessel, a compact woman and her hulking seconds-in-command. Catching herself watching rather than analyzing, Meridia quickly knocked, drew, found aim at each Sestran leader, and then lowered her bow and let the tension release. Then she did it again, staying sharp. The Seekers of Dawn would be their biggest threat if things turned south. Just before the 4 families arrived at the barge, there was a signal, and then in perfect unison, a powerful boom-boom of drums echoed out across the water like thunder, silencing the displays of the entire rest of the fleet. In a moment, half of the cove turned from frenetic colors and sound to total silence and darkness. The sudden quiet had a dizzying effect. The boats all along the Edarin side of the bay stuttered, unsure whether to continue their own displays of intimidation or fall silent. Yosin had their answer, a signal of his own. Next to him, a soldier sounded out a single echoing note that lasted until every hornsman on every vessel and across the entire new city had picked it up. That one note swelled, rising, and then with another signal, all the Edarins too fell silent, leaving nothing on the wind but the sound of 4 watercraft cruising up to the barge and touching onto it as one. There was a smooth flow of activity, and with the Edarin soldiers standing at attention, the leader of each family strode onto the barge, escorted only by a retinue of 2 soldiers. Meridia was surprised, but remained alert. For now, the 4 families were following the Edarin demands to the letter. From the Golden Serpent, 2 veiled warriors escorted the man dressed in gold and bronze. From the 3 Flames, 2 lizard-scale soldiers stood at the shoulders of the magma-clad woman. From the Ravens of Dusk, 1 skinny and 1 fat soldier stepped forward, equally mixed race to their unreadable leader. And finally, the Sestran captain and her hulking seconds strode forward onto the barge. As soon as each set of leaders sat down, the Thorps remaining out on the boats began to glow with power. The glistening gold of the Sandrins, the rippling flames of the Teruvians, the green and white of the Uverans and Icelanders, and finally, the glistening, shimmering blue of Sestrans, all coming to life in vibrant light.
"Hold, men,"
Yosin said, speaking as soon as their gifts came alight.
"Their little display means nothing."
The men around him, elite soldiers all, had made no outward signs of concern, but Meridia knew that any gifts alight was enough to have an Edarin on edge. But as the 4 family leaders sat down, the lights behind them went out. All eyes settled on the leaders of the 4 families and their soldiers, eyes glowing one and all to rival the light of the torches. They were casually elegant, like they had simply decided to grace Edera with their presence. And the small force from the 4 families finally sat down and settled in, opposite the much larger Edarin force. And then, for much longer than Meridia would have thought necessary, the 2 groups sat, eyes on each other, until one of the Edarins leaned over to Yosin. Yosin raised a fist to silence him.
"We will start shortly,"
Yosin said.
"Just as soon as our final guest arrives."
The family leaders stared ahead, unmoved as the wind suddenly picked up off of the ocean, shifting the clouds away from the moon and leaving its crescent light shining down on the barge and the bay. Still, there was no movement, but as the silence ticked on and the clouds returned across the moon, the bells began to toll out the 12 chimes of midnight, and something moved beneath the waves. Out on the water, vessel captains called out, fleeing the empty no-man's land where a groaning shadow had begun to rise through the dark seas. Wary of any distractions, Meridia kept her gaze on Yosin and the family heads. Both Edarin and Freelander, their eyes were locked on each other, ignoring the cries coming from out on the water. It was only when the waters beside the barge began to froth and churn that Meridia finally tore her gaze from the commander and the families for a single moment, facing the ocean as the prow of a dark steel battlecraft emerged from the sea, emblazoned with the shining silver infinite gears of the Machine King. Hey there! If you're hearing this, it means you're listening to the public version of this episode. I appreciate you taking the time and your interest in the series. It really helps the algorithm, it helps us grow. But if you are enjoying the show, maybe take a look over at our Patreon. We have uncut versions of the early episodes, access to new chapters before they're released for the general public, and you can shape the future of the series by deciding on new merch drops, bonus content, and more. You can get started for free at patreon.com/Seventh Valkyrie. That's patreon.com/7THVALKYRIE. Hope to see you there.